My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is the CEO of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity and sometimes host of State of the State, Mike Stenhouse. Welcome to that side of the table,
Mike.
I
haven't been on this side in a few years. Okay.
Our topic is how the state is handling, some would say mishandling, the $1.1 billion it received from the federal printing presses in order to combat the results or the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Stenhouse wrote a Your Turn guest column that was printed recently in the Providence Journal. The editor dubbed the column, and I quote, "Lawmakers fail to strip McKee's emergency powers," which is kind of a strange headline. The late President Ronald Reagan once said, "The closest we come to eternal life on this earth is a government giveaway program." Practically every day in the newspapers and in advertisements, an activist for a cause or an attorney for a special interest group calls for the necessity of that group being funded by government. They all want to feed, it seems, on the COVID money trough. Mike, you wrote that former Governor Raimondo, and I quote, "seized unilateral control by repeatedly declaring states of emergency, a policy that was continued by Governor McKee, while the General Assembly sat idly by while Rhode Islanders suffered for 15 months. Do you have any insight into why the legislative leadership allowed Raimondo and McKee to have free reign?
Sure, I've got strong opinions on it, based on insight from others, but I'll say that I'm going to say some pretty forward things today, but they're my opinions, okay? And I do have some anonymous sources. So, listen, every government person, I don't understand it psychologically, but when they get in power, they want more power. Bruce Springsteen has a saying, "Poor man want to be rich, rich man want to be king, and the king ain't satisfied till he rules everything." That just seems to be the natural order of things. So, given the chance to have executive powers unchecked by the General Assembly, knowing that the third branch, the judicial branch, wouldn't interfere likely, these executives, Raimondo, McKee, others throughout the country, just decided this is our chance to seize power. I still don't know why they want to do it, but they did. And I think what your topic hits on it. They knew that there'd be a lot of money coming down the road from the federal government, the trough, as you called it. And they wanted to be the one to spend it, because when you spend money, when you can hand out money, you get the political favors back. That's what cronyism is, right? So we can seize control for ourselves, and we can control the money to help our political careers. Second, it gets much more complicated than that. We'll get into that, but that's the general setup.
You write that the legislature, quietly slipped a provision into the 2022 state budget that effectively ended Rhode Island's state of emergency and the governor's emergency executive power authority. This meant that the legislature would meet in special fall session, as you say, to gorge themselves at the federal buffet table. I have spoken to 4 state representatives, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and all of them say there is no indication that a special session will be called. Any idea why that is? Are they going to wait until the election year to hand out the money to their constituents?
So we got to take a step back. Remember, for the first 15 months of this pandemic, 16 months, the General Assembly did nothing. They let the executive branch run every aspect of the response to COVID. We had no checks on balances. We had no transparency. We've been arguing, parents have been arguing, they're not providing the research to back up. They keep saying they're following the science, but they're not, because they never provide the science on which these mandates are often, are not based on, I should say. But the only reason the General Assembly got involved in the budget was because now there was this question of this $1.25 billion coming from the federal government as relief aid. And the governor made some early indications that, well, since we're under emergency management, I'll spend it. It's my decision. And the General said, no, if there's going to be political favoritism and cronyism and handouts to make, we're going to make it so we get the political credit. So they had a little fight. Secretly behind the scenes, they slipped this provision into the budget that effectively ended the governor's emergency powers without telling anybody. They just snuck it in there, just like I said, quietly in the middle of the night. I think, I can't confirm this, but I think they had another meeting. It was just about the money, Governor.
Who's they? Oh, they met the
Yeah, the governor said, listen, we just wanted our paws in the money. You can have your emergency powers back as long as we have our paws in the money. And sure enough, 5 or 6 weeks later, McKee declares a second state of emergency, declaring that the Delta variant is a different and distinct emergency from the original virus. It's not very constitutionally sound. It's being challenged now in court. So it's all about the money, and it's all about spending the money to get the crony favors back.
So my information from, quote, anonymous sources is that McKee was actually getting pressure from the teachers' unions and the far left of the Democrat Party as well. And maybe that push came also on the legislative leadership side to force this, quote, meeting of the minds?
Well, maybe. The pressure from the teachers' unions clearly behind these mask mandates, okay? Clearly. If they can influence federally the CDC to change its policy, they certainly have enough clout to influence the Department of Health here and the governor here, and they do. So the mask mandate's all about the teachers' union. It's not about the money so much. So now that the money issue was settled, that the General Assembly was going to have a say in it, they had to be the one to appropriate the money. Now it just became well, who's going to manage the crisis? Just the governor or the General Assembly under normal process with the executive branch? General Assembly doesn't want anything to do with managing this crisis. They're a bunch of cowards. They don't want anything to do with making these difficult decisions. So they said, Governor McKee, if you want your executive powers back, as long as we still have the money, go right ahead. And it was, as you said, the teachers' unions and the far left wing that wanted these school mask mandates, that want these vaccine mandates, said, McKee, you've got to get your emergency powers back so you can start lowering the hammer on everybody. And that's what he did. Now, but with all the pressure groups like ours have raised, the original plan for the fall session, they have abandoned that. Because if they come back in session, there's going to be pressure to not only to overturn the governor like we've raised, and as you saw, there was a letter from 32 House members saying you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing this mask mandate, these executive orders. So again, they're a bunch of cowards. They're going to keep their hands off. They're not going to meet again until they have to meet again until January. That's the information I'm being given right now too. So that's what happened.
Very interesting. And by the way, on the way here to the studio, I heard a local radio news broadcast that said the amount of money we are looking at is $1.9 billion over 2 years, not the $1.1 billion. So now we're approaching $2 billion of giveaway.
Well, let me have you think about this for a second. Can I say one more thing on that?
Absolutely.
This is supposed to be emergency aid. Aid to help small businesses in their recovery. Aid to help improve health, first responders, whatever else you have to pay for to get people vaccines or boosters, or just to take care of them or whatever. Because of this fighting over the money, nothing's going to happen. It's been sitting. We saw the headlines in the Providence Journal, over $1 billion sitting in the bank. If there was an emergency, why aren't we spending it? And it's going to sit there at least until next January, February, or whenever.
Or later.
So it just shows you how corrupting the influence of politics is in this state, the fighting between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Even though it's not a public fight, it's causing this delay in the disbursement of those funds.
Let's talk about that for a minute. On September 22nd, the Providence Journal reported that Governor McKee outlined his spending priorities for $110 million, which is only 10% of that $1.1 billion. McKee said in the article that the state has sat on the money for far too long and is the only state in the Northeast to not have spent any of it. He said his spending priorities, Democrats like to call them investments, are small business assistance, as you said, housing, and child care. He said the plan is, and I'm quoting, at the concept stage and his team is still fleshing out the details of how it would be distributed and to whom, with a goal toward the end of the year. Now, I don't know if they're talking about the end of the calendar year or the end of the fiscal year, but Mike, the legislature and executive branch knew, or at least had, the amount of money we were going to get in March. And now McKee's team is finally fleshing out the details of how to spend just 10% of it 9 months later. What's going on? I mean, this is just incredible to me. If someone says, here, this is an emergency, and nothing happens.
It's obviously not an emergency, right? So it sounds to me as if the legislature said, yeah, Governor, you can spend some of the money whenever you want.
It's part of the deal, perhaps.
Yeah, that's probably the deal. I can't confirm that. But we'll have a hand in appropriating the rest. So again, it just destroys the whole intent of the money. We're the only state in the Northeast that also took the emergency powers away from the governor, right? So that created some serious conflict right there, right? And so that's the tension that exists. It's not the open warfare that existed between Mattiello, the former speaker, and Raimondo, the former governor, though.
Now, on the legislative side, Representative Carlos Tabone, who chairs something called the House Rescue Plan Task Force, will be meeting at some unspecified date to discuss what to do with the money in 3 to 5 months. Now, this is on the legislative side. We've focused so far on the executive side, but the legislature went out in June, and they still haven't, this task force on the House side still has not even met, and they're talking about 3 to 5 months out.
You know, there's a bunch of groups involved in putting recommendations together. The task force, the Rhode Island Foundation has put together a group of people, including former Director of Administration Mike DBAs, who's now head of RIPEC. They even contacted me, said, Mike, we know your center put out a paper. We put it out last spring.
Yeah, I was going to say.
On how some good ways, useful ways this money could be spent to address the crisis, but also have a long-lasting positive effect on the people most effective. They said, we'd like to hear your ideas. So we know there's a lot of groups putting a lot of ideas. They're going to share them with the executive branch. They're going to share them with the legislature. I'm not exactly sure what the process is on how some of these decisions are going to be made. Of course, it's going to be political in the end, I would hope. But the if I could, the number one item we put forth, just to say it, I mean, what is more important than our kids and our kids' education? We know that every child, by having to go to distance learning through most of 2020, some of all of that last school year and into 2021, fell behind. We know they fell behind. So we're proposing a scholarship, $1,000, $2,000 per family, so they can purchase any kind of supplemental educational aid they want, whether it's a tutor or a computer, or some online courses at a college or online somewhere else, whatever it is. Let's help these. So we're calling them catch-up scholarship accounts, education, catch-up ESAs. Let's help these kids catch up, because we know virtually every kid in this state fell behind. That's where I think most of the money should be spent.
Not the whole 1.1 billion.
No,
I mean,
no.
Right.
I'm talking maybe a couple $100 million.
Okay, so I do know if the Senate's side, we're talking about the House, of course, but I'm sure that our friends in the Senate have some sort of a task force as well. Do you know if they have something similar to what Representative Tabone chairs?
I'm not aware.
Okay.
But the Senate will have its say, and before anything passes the General Assembly, they'll get their say. But I don't know if they do or not.
Okay. But it just seems to me it would have made sense, and maybe that's why they didn't do it, to have a joint select committee, House and Senate, and so they could come up with
This would be the time for one of those.
Yeah,
absolutely. I agree with you,
exactly.
Richard.
Now, in the York Turn column on September 22nd, Governor McKee notes that, quote, the state reported a 7.2% increase in real GDP, gross domestic product, in the first quarter of 2021, exceeding the growth rates of the country and New England. And according to Moody's, what they call their back to normal economic recovery index, Rhode Island ranked 4th in the nation and 1st in the region. Now, everywhere I go, and I'm sure our audience sees the same thing, there are help wanted signs everywhere. A local supermarket chain that I visited had posted signs telling customers that the scarcity of certain items on the shelf is due to labor issues among suppliers and transporters of these products. It seems to any interested observer that the economic recovery from the pandemic is well underway. Why does the governor think we need to invest soon and invest wisely in order to continue to lead rather than follow? At this stage of the economic cycle, it seems recovery is underway, and now the government is going to pump more money into the state's economy?
Well, first of all, about the Q1 figures, we had been among the worst in the nation, so our recovery was delayed. So the fact that we finally had a good quarter, the rest of the nation already had their good quarters, right? So let's not read too much into that. I would still bet, and I haven't looked recently, that if we look at the larger period of recovery, that we're still probably well down in the bottom. The issue you talk about the workers is absolutely true. The federal unemployment benefit was so generous. So many people stayed home. You're right, truckers, manufacturers, delivery people can't find enough workers. They can't move goods. The ports are backed up. I mean, so it starts at the ports, it goes to the truckers, the trains, the store clerks, the manufacturers who do manufacture in this country. We've been seeing warnings there's going to be a massive supply chain problem. And it's not because the supply and demand equation is broken, it's because the worker issue is broken. We have enough capacity to produce the supply. We don't have enough capacity to deliver it because of this huge mistake that Biden and the federal government made in putting that ridiculously generous federal unemployment on. And it's a nation and a state that would have recovered much sooner had it not been there.
Yeah. Well, we had a Democrat and a Republican representative on this program recently, and both said they believe the $13 billion plus budget for this fiscal year, which is really $2 billion more than the governor originally asked for, will become the baseline for future budgets. Can the Rhode Island economy stand to have the state carving out this much money forever?
So don't forget, before the pandemic, we were under $10 billion a year.
Yep.
So this budget has been falsely, I don't want to say falsely, but artificially inflated because of all the federal money coming in. What we've been arguing since our inception for over 10 years is when you accept federal money and the strings that often come with them, or even if there aren't no strings, and somebody, just like you said, who would you quote Reagan earlier, once they make a handout, it's there to stay. So even if it was one-time only federal money, the people with their hands out are going to want that every single year, and it sounds like these lawmakers are giving into that. I mean, there's no reason this budget shouldn't go back to under $10 billion again. If they keep it at $13 billion without that $2 or $3 billion of federal money coming in, major problems for the Rhode Island economy. Yep. Because businesses and taxpayers can't handle anymore. We're already among the highest taxed and burdened in the nation, among the highest.
Yeah. I heard a political commentator say this past week that the reason the California voters returned Governor Gavin Newsom to office in a recall election that was held recently is because 20 to 30% of the residents of California are on government assistance. And the Teachers and Public Employees Union joined the Hollywood and Silicon Valley elite, pouring millions into Newsom's campaign. And that campaign was really aimed at the black conservative Republican Larry Elder and two other minor candidates. Newsom received 62% of the vote, and Elder was somewhere in the mid-30s. Now, before she left for Washington, Governor Raimondo said 33% of Rhode Island received some form of state assistance. And Governor Gina Raimondo said you add the public employees and teachers and their families, and it seems really unlikely that we will ever again see a fiscally conservative governor or member of our congressional delegation, because instead of the ocean state, we can become the state of dependency. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a very valid point, and that is the whole goal of the Democrat Party right now. It's a whole goal of socialism, is to get people dependent on the government, and then they'll do what the government wants, and they'll vote for more government, which usually translates into left-leaning progressives or Democrats. But there's another factor at play here too, and it's what we were talking about earlier. I would bet, I haven't seen it, but I would bet 10 to 1. I'll give you 10 to 1 odds that Newsom took that federal money, made sure he spent it in the months and the quarter before the election, not only so everyone was going to get their handouts, but it also helped the economy recover. So he could say, look, our economy, just like Rhode Island's having a good quarter now, you know, I bet you California had a good last quarter or two because they spent the money done to boost it. They say, you don't want to change out now. We're recovering right now. Why would you want to change? So, see, that's what I mean. When you control the money, you can control the narrative, you can control the voters, and that's why there's this fight in Rhode Island between the General Assembly, I should say, the legislature, and the executive branch. And $1.2 billion in Rhode Island is a heck of a lot of money.
Also seems to
a lot of political favors in there.
Yeah, and it also seems to be friction within the Democratic Party because as you read the paper, the progressive Matt Brown is now declared for governor, running with a left-wing representative of one term as a quote a running mate, even though they're two general officers.
It's more than left wing, Dick.
Yeah, and
these are open socialists.
Yeah, and so I guess my thought is the progressive movement within the Democratic Party seems to be, they really refer to the conservative Democrats as the enemy, and that they're not upholding the principles of the Democratic Party, and they seem to be gaining traction. Does your Center for Freedom and Prosperity have any thoughts on that movement?
We've been talking about this for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And Nick Mattiello made a big mistake. You know, he knew that he knew it was going to get to this point. He made comments. You remember when he said, I'm going to be the firewall against a progressive agenda. I'm not going to endorse any progressive candidates. Remember, he even endorsed a moderate candidate against the incumbent progressive, and he had to backtrack on that. Everybody knew that it was going to get to the point down the road where the Progressive Party would become a cancer in the Democrat Party and that it was going to cause some kind of blow up. It's a slow explosion happening right now, but nobody has the courage to say, you're out, go form your own party. That's what they should do. Go form, just like the Tea Party should have left the Republican, or go form their own Tea Party. Once you try to infect the larger party, there's a fight. And we had that fight 10 years ago with the Tea Party. Now we're going to have that fight, I think, in the coming years with the Democrat Party. And they really, unless the Democrats just want to give in and totally become socialists themselves, I'm not sure how it's going to turn out. But the media, when you say gain traction, that's the media, right? The media creates the narrative, and they're fully supportive of the progressive socialist left.
And I think that applies at the state level, and certainly it applies at the national level if we're looking at the macro effects of all of this, because Nancy Pelosi came out a couple of days ago and told us not to worry about the $3.5 trillion spending plan they're proposing, and look at the values. Don't worry about the dollars. Look at the values and what they represent, to Americans. And I mean, that to me is completely.
Let me talk about values. Can I talk about values
absolutely.
For a second?
Go ahead.
Again, this is all the General Assembly's fault, in my view, for sitting on their hands. For 18 months, they didn't care that our constitutional rights were being trampled. They didn't care that Rhode Island had one of the worst health responses to COVID. For the longest time, our case rates, hospitalization, death rates were among the worst. They didn't care that Rhode Island economy was suffering, businesses were closing, landlords were going out of business. They didn't care about any of that. The only thing they cared about is when it came time to spend that $1.2 billion. Then they were inspired to get off their duffs and do something. You want to talk about values, you tell me what that says.
Thank you, Mike. I want to spend the remaining few minutes on a brief editorial comment, if I may. Those of you who are regular viewers of this program know that we have run a three-part series on the subject of whether critical race theory and its sibling, critical gender theory, are being taught in Rhode Island schools. In part 3, we interviewed North Kingstown Town Council member Mary Breimer, who was one of that town's residents attempting to recall school committee member Jennifer Lima. Mrs. Lima is leading a group called Toward an Anti-Racist North Kingstown, or TANK. She is co-person of a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee that was established by the school committee. We extended an invitation to Mrs. Lima to come on this program to offer her viewpoints on the subject. She declined. Citing my interview with Councilwoman Breimer, Mrs. Lima said, and I quote, "She has no confidence that I would be an impartial interviewer." Instead, she provided a statement to be read on the air. As a matter of policy, we do not read statements from guests who decline to come on and be interviewed. Those of you who are regular viewers know that I try to ask questions based on the guest's verbal and written comments. I've had guests say that I ask tough questions, but never have any of them accused me of being biased or unfair. Mrs. Lima claims that critical race theory is merely a legal theory, and her goal is to get, I quote, age-appropriate and accurate lessons into the classroom. The problem is, who is to decide what is age-appropriate for elementary school students, some of whom are 5 and 6 years old? Who determines what lessons, say, in history class are accurate? It should be noted that in July, Governor McKee signed a law that will require a state-mandated curriculum on Black history in grades kindergarten through 12th grade. And this is the culmination of an initiative by Governor Raimondo. Mrs. Lima states that CRT is a vague legal term that has many definitions. I have read only one, and I quote, "Critical race theory is a body of legal scholarship and an academic movement of U.S. civil rights scholars and activists who seek to critically examine the intersection of race and U.S. law and to challenge mainstream American liberal approaches to racial justice." Note it's liberal approaches to racial justice. Mrs. Lima is correct that elementary school students will not be taught legal theory, but they will be introduced to the concept of equity that has replaced equality in the classroom. We have the concept of equity is an essential part of CRT, and equity means equal outcomes regardless of an individual's talent, input, or effort. We have an open invitation to Jennifer Lima and/or members of her TANK group to come on State of the State and share their reasons for pushing a diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda in North Kingstown schools. Thank you, and thanks, Mike, for coming on State of the State as a guest rather than a host.
My pleasure, Richard. Nice job.